Welcome everyone to our December version 2020 of our career chat. Today we have Dr. Julie Shi, and she's going to be telling us about her career path in the biotech pharma world, and we'll be taking questions from our student participants. So welcome for all you listening through the video, and we hope you can get some takeaways from today's session. Dr. Shi, take it away if you can tell us about your career path in about 5 to 10 minutes and things you learned along the way.
Sure. So I guess to start, my position currently is a senior scientist at Bristol Myers Squibb in the cell therapy development and operations group. And so I'm an American, so I grew up in Pennsylvania and ended up going to college at MIT in Cambridge, and that's where I got my bachelor's in chemical engineering. And then after I finished my bachelor's, I was interested in both research and exploring, I guess, positions in industry. And so I did a short internship at Biogen IDEC after I graduated from my undergrad in their process purification department. And that was before I went to graduate school at the University of Washington in Seattle. And so my focus of my research is on developing non-viral, I guess, polymer for non-viral delivery with synthetic materials, so with polymers, lipids, etc. And that's what I spent most of my PhD working on. While I was doing my PhD, I think similarly to most of you, didn't really know what I wanted to do, but I really did like research. And so I decided to pursue a postdoc in something that might be related to what I was already doing, but slightly different. And I guess I came up with a strategy before starting my postdoc because I know that people can kind of get stuck in a postdoc for multiple years. So I said that if I wanted to pursue an academic career, I wanted to pursue a postdoc in a lab where I could start a project and have kind of basically test out how I would get grants and et cetera. So kind of like a mini intro to professorship. And so I decided to do a postdoc in Shana Kelly's lab at the University of Toronto. So I moved to Toronto, never having lived in Canada before. But I mean, Toronto is great, so I have no complaints. And I ended up doing a postdoc for almost 2 years in Shana's lab, and started a few projects, but I also ended up having a child at the same time. And I think that kind of made me realize that I wasn't sure if I really wanted to pursue the academic life. But I still really enjoy research. And so I decided to move back to the US after my 2 years kind of was up because I didn't want to start another project. And then start pursuing job opportunities in the US. And again, I'm American, so you guys actually kicked me out. Okay. So when I returned back to the US, my husband and I kind of had to think about where we wanted to settle down, and so we both had gone to college in Boston, and which is a big biotech hub, and then also San Francisco is another hub, San Diego, and then also Seattle, which is where I went for grad school. And if we thought about where we wanted to settle down, I think just based on where we wanted to live, we decided to head back to Seattle. And that was back in 2015 is when we moved back. So the job market at that point was a little rough. So we spent a long time traveling from Toronto to Seattle. It took over 3 months. And so we very slowly drove over the entire country. And then I spent some time looking for jobs, but my background is, I think, a little bit atypical for the region. It's a non-viral biomaterial sort of background, and the work that I did in my postdoc was more kind of mitochondrial biology focused, and so there wasn't a lot of stuff going on in Seattle, but I got lucky. Maybe like 5 or so months after I moved to Seattle, and there was this startup company at the time called Juno Therapeutics, and that was starting one of the starting, or I guess more or larger companies at the time that was working on CAR T therapy, which I honestly had no experience in. So they were looking for someone with specifically my background, surprisingly, to start off their non-viral work in the company. And the company at that time was about 400 employees, and ended up hiring me as an entry-level scientist to start this non-viral project there. And then so that was joining well, I wouldn't say a small startup company is really fun, also terrifying at the same time. And if over the years, as I've been there, we've now been acquired twice. So we were acquired by Celgene about a year and a half or so in, and then most recently acquired Celgene was acquired by Bristol Myers Squibb. And the entire time we've still hold down the fort in Seattle, focusing on cell therapy. And in my role with starting the non-viral work at Juno, and eventually now BMS, it's mostly a technology development group that's focused on developing technologies for cell therapy manufacturing. And so it kind of is a research project, but very applied. And then now I recently actually transferred to a new team to branch out my expertise and learning more about the drug product development process. And so I am now part of the allogeneic cell therapy program team. And so that's where I am now. And if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer.
Oh, thank you, Julie. Yeah, thanks for that. I was taking down notes. That's a nice journey. Thank you for sharing. And while I'm waiting for questions in the chat, I mean, I have tons of questions. So I will start. And while I have these questions, if anyone has any, you can just type them in the chat and I'll address them as we go along. So I guess I wanted to ask about the 2 acquisitions that happened to you. And some of the questions I do get from students is, well, I don't know, a startup, it's really risky, job stability, that's what I worry about. So maybe you can address just being under that environment. What was it like when you were small? And by the way, 400 employees, that's to me a very large startup. Yeah, I came from a startup with like 15 people, so that was pretty small. But if you can just explain to the process of what it was like undergoing these acquisitions through your career for you personally.
Oh yeah. So I think we were in a little bit of a different situation than maybe how a lot of acquisitions happen, in that Celgene acquired us because we had developed a lot of expertise in terms of technical development and manufacturing of cell therapies, which at the time was not something that a lot of companies had. And Celgene had already actually invested like $1 billion into us, and so it probably was just a matter of time before they acquired us. So when we got acquired, none of us felt like we were going to lose our jobs or anything, because there weren't that many people to hire for cell therapy, and so it would be not a good idea if Celgene got rid of us. So yeah, it was yeah, I think maybe a little bit different than some of the other acquisitions.
It sounds like the transition was pretty seamless.
Yes and no. So it was a little confusing because Celgene also had their own cell therapy collaborations with other companies outside of Juno. So it's a little bit interesting trying to work through that part of it. But yeah, in terms of like, am I going to have a job? That was never a question of there. Yeah, and then with the most recent acquisition with BMS acquiring Celgene, I think we all felt similarly. We're still in the same place in that not too many people have this expertise. And BMS came in acquiring us with zero expertise in cell therapy. So they were very interested in keeping us.
Great, thank you. Lisa, you had a few questions. You want to unmute yourself and ask away?
Yeah, definitely. Thank you so much for sharing your experience. And I don't want to take this over, so I will start with a couple of questions, but I have like 7 written down. So I'm new into my PhD, and I'm really interested in going into the industry field. I was wondering, so the quick question is, for the internship, is that something that the PhD student typically looks into doing, or is that after PhD you do an internship for a little bit before employment? So that was my first quick question that I wanted to clarify with you. And then my second question that I wanted to check with you were some of the top reasons why one would choose industry over academia or the other way around. I just want to get a clear sense of the pros and cons of both fields.
Oh, sure. So to answer your first question, I actually have had PhD students as interns before. So it's possible. You have to work it out with your advisor, though. I think that's the core bottleneck of that. But it is there. I guess from where I see it, there aren't a lot of internship programs that are geared towards PhD students, and so those are mostly you get them through networking. And I think you'll have a lot more success in getting those sorts of experiences through networking, and also at smaller companies where it's a little bit more fluid about whether or not you can make a position like that from the company side of things. So hopefully that answers your first question. And then the second piece of it was like the differences between academia and industry, right? So I think my main motivation throughout my career has always been I like science, and I like doing science. The differences between an academic research environment and industry research environment are as kind of surrounding structure and resources and prioritization. So in academia, I guess depending on how your lab is set up, you kind of have free reign over whatever you're doing. But on the downside, if you don't know what you want to do, it might be a little hard for you to get through your graduate work. In a company environment, because time is money, if you don't know what you need to do, you have to ask people, particularly like what your group is supposed to be doing. And so it's a defined scope of work. for us, at least where I am, we have a lot of ability to come up with new ideas, and there's actually a mechanism for kind of vetting the ideas and getting money and resources to pursue it. And so I guess those are the main differences. I'm still like very technically challenged on a daily basis, and so I find my work very enjoyable. So it's just those are, I think, the main differences.
And if I can just add to your first question, Lisa, I put in the chat the different funding resources if you want to do an internship during your graduate school that's available for you in Canada. So SWILP is a federal program, which is, I even forget what the acronym stands for, but it's for students, graduate students or undergrads. And if you want to take some time out of your studies and go for an internship, and the only requirement is it's anything to do to enhance the bioeconomy. So anything biomedical sciences, communications, whatever that is. And then it's a salary that they give you. So if you find a company that you want to work for the summer or even part-time, over the course, then they can help provide the funding. So it kind of helps you when you're proposing this to your supervisor, because funding might be an issue. And there's also Ontario Center of Excellence. They also have stipends for internships. And then MyTax has their own programs. And sort of what Julie was saying, none of these internships are advertised anywhere. It's not like you can go to a website, oh, here's all the companies that have the internships. But it's up to you to find out what companies you want to potentially intern for, and then create those internships yourself. So most of my students that have gone through my program, that's what they've done, is created their own internships. And if you're interested, Lisa, you can contact me afterwards as well.
Thank you so much for the information.
You're welcome. And the Ontario Center of Excellence, they also have internships post your graduate degree. So if you've finished your master's or PhD, if you want to take a year or two to work in industry, they actually have that right after your grad degree. And the comment about industry and academia, since I was in industry as well, I was in a much smaller company, let's say 15 people. So I would say, I was still writing grants, still training students, still had interns. Does this job description sound familiar? So it's very similar if you are in the R&D space, that your academic and industry, like the research is very similar, but you'll be applying for different grants. And yes, you will be, the direction of the research is going to be by the business plan. And we do have some, freedom to do a little bit of what we want to work on, as long as that project is going towards saving either time, money, resources for the company, and it's a great idea. They give you what's called a 10% rule, like a 10% flex time, where you can work on your own projects for that sort of intellectual property freedom. So let's go to Umama's question. You had a question? You want to unmute yourself?
Yeah, sure. So, Julie, you were talking about how you did an academia postdoc and then went into industry. So I just want to ask, in retrospect, would you have done an industry postdoc as opposed to an academic one? And would that help you set up better into your career in industry? And the second part is, I wanted to ask you about your opinions regarding industry postdoc and the availability of them, because I find those kind of hard to find, and I think those might be more available through networking as opposed to finding an academic postdoc where you just contact the supervisor yourself. So, any insights?
Yeah. Oh yeah. It's funny. So I interestingly have had multiple postdocs, or like current. Yes, so I'll elaborate on that in a second. So when I was looking for a postdoc, I don't know if this is just because of bias, but I was highly recommended to not pursue an industry postdoc. And I think there are a couple of valid points that were brought up. One is, if you're planning on going to academia, I don't think an industry postdoc is not looked kindly upon, I guess, in terms of your resume. It's also harder to publish from an industry postdoc. And so given that papers are kind of your academic currency, it's highly advised to not pursue a postdoc in industry. The other thing is the kind of similar to academia, the quality of the postdoc is very highly variable depending on the company. Like I know that Genentech has like a very formal and prestigious kind of postdoc program. The way that we've had postdocs is that we have people who, well, so the way that postdoc positions have come about at Juno/Celgene/BMS, whatever I was part of, they usually arose because, one, we didn't have enough money to fund a full scientist, and it was a pretty high-risk project. Two, we had someone very overqualified apply for a much lower level position. Like, for example, someone who came out with an academic postdoc but applied for a senior research associate role, which is like essentially a master's graduate role. And we really valued their expertise, and so we just made a postdoc position for them. So those are basically the two reasons why we have a postdoc. I think our department, the cell therapy development group, is trying to formalize a actual postdoc program. So that might be something I think we are pursuing. And interestingly, this might help for networking. I also have a postdoc position that we're trying to hire for. So if anyone's interested, they can reach out to me. But they kind of come up randomly, and usually are projects that are interesting to pursue, but we don't have enough time or resources to dedicate a full-time scientist to. So yeah, did that answer all your questions?
Yeah, sure.
Oh, okay.
Thank you.
So.
Yeah, thanks, Julie. So perhaps I can add to that as well. I was actually speaking to a senior faculty member, and he realizes, the landscape is changing. So if you go to, and similar to what Julie was saying, it kind of depends on where you go, right? So if you go to a company where there's no publications, then that's not a good place for you to do a postdoc if you're thinking of coming back into academia. So it kind of went back to Julie's point about, it's not looked upon as favorably. It's the ones that are not, let's say, paper driven or publication driven, then that's not going to help you back into the academy. So that's something to think about. If you are thinking about doing an industry postdoc, it could be a stepping stone to get into that company. But if you want to keep your options open for academia, you have to make sure whatever you apply for, they're open for publications, and for you to be a productive scientific thought leader. So by the time you finish with that industry postdoc, you can take some of that project and make it your own. So they have to be able to provide that for you, right? So that's the only caveat I would put in there. Prashad, you want to ask? Oh, you had a follow-up?
Oh, I was just wanted to say that I was considering industry postdoc as a stepping stone, as you said, as opposed to coming back to academia. So, so that's why I wanted to ask: is it beneficial to have one as opposed to just applying for, let's say, a research scientist position after doing a PhD?
So with the two postdocs that I know of, we've since they're now full-time employees at the company. And I mean, they were doing well. So I think it depends on what job is available. Like if I don't know if either or is better or worse. It's just what's available to work in. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And also, like, I'm also thinking of doing it in order to expand my skill set, as opposed to really taking just what I've learned from before and applying that, but really expanding that and then continuing into the industry. So that's why I asked.
Oh yeah, I think one of the pluses of if you're trying to get into industry and you find an industry postdoc that you're well suited to do. The plus is that you'll kind of get embedded into like industry speak. There's a lot of industry speaks and just knowing how companies are run that is beneficial for your own career development, and I think helps if you ever decide to go work for a different company. It's a lot. You gain a lot of like, oh, now I know how to speak in the same words that you guys are speaking in.
Thank you.
Yeah. I think you should perhaps think about it as, we're so used to titles and, oh, this is academia, this is industry, this is government, but really it's research, right? So if you find a good lab where you can publish, do well, set up collaborations, work with people, and you're not by yourself, right? You want to show you can be in a team and still publish and do things, and you're a dynamic place and you're building your core competency skills. I don't think it really, like, as long as that, again, the publishing and also developing as a scientific thought leader, as long as that's happening, like where you do that, it could be in, an NSERC or an NIH, or, it could be in a government. So I think just making sure you're at a good place, at a good institution that's well-funded, and you're not the sole postdoc somewhere. I think that is most important. So Farshad, do you want to ask your question?
Sure. I have a few, but I'm just going to stop at the one that I posted. How research intensive is your current day-to-day operations? And the reason I asked this, I just want to get a sense of whether the type of position you're in is mostly managing science. So basically you're the brain behind managing multiple projects that is happening at the bench by people other than yourself, or is it that you actually do quite a bit of science yourself by either writing manuscripts, looking at data, or yeah, basically that's my question.
Yeah, so I do manage people, and so I think it depends on a few things. So when I joined Juno, and for the first, like, I would say 3 or 4 years of being there, I was in the lab every day doing work, and also thinking like more broadly, how is my project going to, like, what's this technical strategy, and just thinking about how to frame it from a technologic or like business case sort of thing in order to get the project to go. So even though I was doing science on a day-to-day basis, I still have to think about that sort of thing in order to drive the project forward. And then once I was somewhat successful in doing that, I started getting resources to actually grow the project a bit. And so I still am very technically involved in that I'm reviewing study plans and experiments and data, but I spend a lot of time now doing the like managing part of it, and it's a little bit different in that I had an interest in thinking about the bigger picture and trying to form collaborations and across different departments to try to see how we could work together. And that's all like done not at the bench.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I mean, I still like doing bench work. And so if the people that report to me are busy and I'm like, I really want to do this experiment, I'll just make some time in my calendar to go and do it. So even up to when we started our work from home period in March, I was like halfway through an experiment. And then they're like, don't come in anymore. I was like, no, my cells, but okay. Yes.
Fair enough. Do I get to ask one more question?
Yeah, sure, go ahead.
I almost have a strategic, like, I'm trying to figure out what to do. And there are two motivations behind this question. Personally, I find academic work quite exciting. To have that freedom to do whatever you want. Sometimes, I mean, a lot of the great work of the past century was done by people who started something for which their grant got rejected multiple times. But that type of thinking would probably not fly as easily in an industry setting where impact is not as obvious. So I like academic work, but then at the same time, I need to live in the real world, and in the real world, I need to make money. I have a family. I want to go ahead and get on with my life. So right now, I'm trying to decide sort of what to do, and whether an industry level, an industry approach to the next career step that I'm taking can provide a bit of both. Can you be an independent thinker within reason? You mentioned the 10% time that you get to work on your own projects, but what I'm thinking is only 10% is very little. So can you be that? Can you be that independent scientist outside the realm of the project scheme defined by the company?
Yeah, yes and no. So I think so I'm in a development group, and I'm also an engineer by training. So I'm highly motivated by applied science. When I work with my colleagues in research, a lot of the things that they're working on are what I would imagine you work on in academia, except that you are doing it in a company. And so it's very discovery, high risk, something that's cool that hasn't been done before, but may not work. But if it does work, like us people in development would be like, let's figure out how to actually get that into manufacturing.
Oh, that's incredible.
So so you can do that, but it has to be within the scope of what the company does. So like our research group is like, they have to figure out how to make good CAR T cells and engineer TCRs. And so if you're like, well, I want to just figure out what, I don't know, this random other cell does in the body, it's probably not going to fly. Yeah. So there's always going to be this prioritization of like, here are all of my ideas. Then there's goals that are like kind of cascaded down, but they're not very they're not like super detailed goals, but you still have to fall within some sort of corporate goal.
I see.
Yeah. But yeah, and I think at larger pharma companies, they do have a bit more, I guess, freedom to do that sort of work. Because at a startup company, like you have to make a product, otherwise the company's not going to make it. Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of, you still get to do cool research.
No, it definitely sounds like, at least in your position, you are being an independent principal investigator. Like in effect, it really feels that way. Thank you. That's it. That's all I ask.
Yeah. And so if I could add to that, so my previous experience at a biotech company, we designed software for in silico simulation of nucleic acids. So our hybridization. And so I remember being at, and this was a really cool thing, is I remember being at a conference and we speaking to potential clients, big biotech and pharma, and they would say, oh, we're working on a microarray. We're trying to put 50 primers together in one tube. Do you do that? And we would say, sure, right? And then we just turn around and come up with that design because this client has asked for it. And that in itself is really exciting because now you're helping the client, you're helping them advance their science, and you are coming up with optimal approaches using your platform. So that's a really exciting part as well. You're helping multiple scientists who is, as a partner, as a collaborator for your company. So it can be really exciting for sure. Julia, you had a couple questions. Would you like to unmute yourself?
Yeah, I have more than I wrote here as well. So I guess we all have a lot of questions for you guys. I guess the first two that I'll start with are just the ones that I have here. So you mentioned that you decided to move to Seattle, but do you think that your job opportunities in Seattle were really kind of different than the ones that you could have gotten in Boston or San Francisco? Like, are there kind of patterns of what each of these areas like really focus on? Or do you think that you could have found, I guess, success in any of these places based on your expertise?
Oh, yeah, I think it's highly location dependent. So if you're thinking about where to move to, there's a couple of different approaches. Well, I would highly recommend just visiting the local life sciences group. So Washington State has a Washington State Life Sciences. No, I can't remember. They renamed it, but it's a local bio-focused group where a lot of the companies will post their job positions, and being well researched in what the area's particular focus is helpful in finding a job. So for example, Boston's really diverse, so it's I think if you go into biotech and are looking for any job, Boston is a pretty good place to go. The Seattle hub is very focused on cell therapy. And so we also have Seattle genetics, and so some antibody drug conjugate work. But the academic research that's coming, or the research that's coming out of the academic and research institutions here are highly focused on cell therapy. So we have our academic institutions like Seattle Children's, the Fred Hutch. There's also the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. So there's a lot of global health and infectious disease sort of research going on here. And this is really specific to Seattle. So I think I definitely could have found a job much quicker in Boston, but I didn't want to move back there. And I not that I have anything against the city, it's just cold. Then San Francisco is also another hub if you can survive the high cost of living there. And San Diego is also a pretty good hub. So every city has its own kind of specialties, and in order to maximize your chances of having a I guess successful job hunt, it would be helpful if you had a background that was well suited for that hub's expertise. I think I got very lucky in that my background is probably better suited for Boston, but they had this one position in a random cell therapy company, and I got very lucky.
So Julia,
that's really interesting.
So Julia, we'll get to your second question, but before we do that, I'm just going to say bye to our viewers at home who's watching this later. So Julie, if you can give one piece of advice to all of our listeners out there who are trying to decide either academia or industry, or what industry is like, or how can they prepare themselves for that career right now as graduate students, whether they're in first year, second year, or fifth year?
Yes, so I think attending things like this is very helpful to kind of learn about other people's jobs, and if it sounds like something that you'd be interested in doing. The second part is I would really recommend just reaching out to people. Like, you can search through them on LinkedIn, and people are generally really happy to talk to you about their careers. I mean, I recently just hired a scientist who participated in something like this, and so this was, he didn't apply. I was like, your background is really well suited for this role, and you should apply. So a lot of stuff like that happens, and I would encourage you to not be shy.
Great. Well, thank you, Julie. The take-home message is do not be shy and reach out to people. And so we're going to end the recording there. We're going to say happy holidays to our viewers. And then we're going to stay tuned for our listeners to ask her some more questions. Bye, everyone at home.
Hi. Thanks for hearing me talk.